We're also talking today about oppressions that happen within a household and how they're different than the ones that are not. And this is something you can see on your social location map. All the ones that have the little broken hearts on them, this is some of the stuff that happens in the dynamics within a household. If we think about the control that somebody within a household can exert on somebody else, it's pretty extreme. They can withhold food, clothing, they can inflict physical pain legally, they can restrict contact, they can restrict transportation, and this is something that doesn't happen with the other oppressions that aren't within a household. So the dynamics are different, and we've got to think about them a bit. We're talking about queer oppression as an example of these familial oppressions, but these dynamics repeat over different ones, for example, like psychiatric diagnosis, or sizeism, or sexism, when it's your father who can control everything that you do because you are a woman. Then the dynamic is really different than if it was, for example, the factory owner or a racist cop. So we're looking at some of the dynamics within a household and how they can be really different. When it's your own mother who's saying that you're an abomination, that has a different impact. It carries a different kind of weight that's harder to cope with. And this is where we're seeing one of the biggest risks for queer folks is their youth, because they're under the control of somebody who can control everything from food to pain to clothing. And how those dynamics work and how we might resist them is really tricky. We have the example of the two teenagers. We have the Blackish video that you watched, where it's a black family kind of trying to train the young folks on how to deal with the racism that's outside of their family. How do you interact with the cops? What's happening in the outside world? And so they have this safe space at home where somebody kind of knows the skills to survive this particular oppression. And then we have the contrast of the teenager who kept rushing home to videotape the soap opera so that he could watch himself, any kind of image of himself on TV. And I like this story because it talks to me about the desperation of just trying to reach out to somebody. Is there anybody out there who understands me? Is there a way that I can know how to be in the world? And having to connect through a TV as your only source of support is really heartbreaking. These are oppressions in which you may not have anybody around you who can support you and guide you. And when it's just yourself in a sea full of people who are telling you to hate yourself, there's almost no way to resist that. My favorite story from internalized oppression was from when I was 19 years old. I went to a party with my first girlfriend, and I was hanging out with one of her friends who sat me down and said, "So, was this your first kiss with a girl?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "So, how was it?" I said, "Well, it was kind of fun, kind of sexy." And she leaned over, and he was like, No, like, but how was it? How did you feel?" And I said, "Well, it was kind of exciting and kind of nervous and pretty fun." And he said, No, but like, how did you feel?" And so at that point, I was like, "I think I'm not understanding you. What are you trying to ask me?" And he said, "So the first time I kissed a guy, I spent the whole night crying and puking." So for him, his first kiss with a guy wasn't exciting. It wasn't sexy. It was horrifying. It was him finally not being able to put that part of himself down. It was him finally becoming the abomination that everybody said he was. So it wasn't fun. It was horrifying. And this is what happens when people convince you that you are awful. And that's what internalized oppression is. Something to think about is that having the family that you were born into is a giant source of privilege. We don't often think of it that way. It's a source of wealth. If we think of that there are folks that systematically lose their birth families, and these are queer folks, we got to think of those dynamics and try to incorporate them into the way we structure society. So for example, FAFSA, financial aid, is somewhat connected to your parents' income, without taking into account that queer folks may not have access to that income in the same way that straight folks might. Another thing to think about is the notion of chosen family. So if your birth family has thrown you out and you've lost them, it may take you decades to build up a chosen family. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and they may not be around in the ways that you would need them to be. And after all that time and effort, the law backs you up in absolutely no way. So in my case, my best friend is a lot closer to me than my brother is. But since there's no blood relationship, the government and the structures don't recognize this as any kind of important relationship. So for example, in my case, if I wanted to help somebody migrate into this country, since I have citizenship, I could offer that help to my brother, but not to my best friend. We're also thinking about the ways that resistance looks different within a family unit. When you are a teenager and somebody's controlling your food and housing, there's not much you can do about it. There's going to be a lot of times in which you need to deny yourself to make sure that you are fed and safe. Even as an adult, when you need to resist against parents, it's a different dynamic. So there are some interesting stories of sibling solidarity, like one sister giving her trans sister clothing because the parents won't allow her to have female clothing, or boycotting Christmas. And so if the parents say, you can't come with your girlfriend, your sibling saying, if she can't bring the girlfriend, then I'm not going either. And we're all going to have Christmas dinner by ourselves, and if you don't want any of us around, that's too bad for you. All of a sudden, the power dynamic can shift. But it's really dependent sometimes on age and the access to the support that you have. One more thing to think about when we're talking about queer issues, which is really important, is that for many folks, coming out may mean losing their birth families, and that can be incredibly painful. It could be equivalent to thinking of having all of your family die in a car crash. If that were to happen to somebody, we would have a lot of mechanisms of support for them. There would be casseroles and fundraisers and all kinds of ways to support this young person who's lost their entire family. When it comes to coming out, we don't have the same tactics around that. So as you're speaking with somebody who's queer, make sure that you honor the fact that coming out may be incredibly painful to them, that you may be asking about the time their whole family died in a car crash. Don't bring that up casually. Make sure that you treat it with respect and kindness and dignity. And that's it for today. I'll see you next week.